In the 1960s and 70s, author John Keel published a series of books, as well as a newsletter that seemed to posit a link between UFOs, Bigfoot, ghosts, and the various other unexplained mysteries, as if they were part and parcel of the same thing. Anyone who spends any amount of time studying Fortean literature will begin to see a lot of crossover with regards to cases, noting Bigfoot and big cat sightings in areas with a lot of UFO activity, cryptid encounters leading to hauntings, etc. No better such example of this crossover phenomenon comes to mind than what happened over a 2-year span, beginning in 1967 to residents living in Scotia, New York, a case that involved UFOs, the Men in Black, missing animals, a dead teenager, and even poltergeist activity. Join me as I delve into mystery on the Mohawk River. Beginning in mid-1967, Jennifer Stevens, a UFO investigator living in Scotia, New York, started receiving letters from people living around the Mohawk River with regards to strange things that were occurring. Stevens was the director of the Extraterrestrial Phenomenon Investigating Committee, or EPIC. She also worked as the editor and publisher of UFO Skywatch magazine. It makes sense that she and her family would be the ones to become so immersed in the events to follow. The first report happened in April 1967, when a woman was walking her visiting friend out to her car at around 11 o'clock at night. A very large bright star caught their attention as they stood talking. As they watched, the star began to descend rapidly. In a matter of seconds, it was hovering above the trees right across the street from them. They were both a little fascinated and somewhat afraid. As they began to question each other about what they thought it was, suddenly a barbell-sized projectile, that one of them later described as, quote, an ugly red color, shot from the UFO and went whizzing over their heads and disappeared into the trees across the street. With that, the UFO shot away at a tremendous rate of speed. One of the women, Pegy, was still puzzling over the experience the next morning when a neighbor dropped in, remarking, "The strangest thing happened last night. Johnny, her 12-year-old son, got up to go to the bathroom at about 11 and rushed into my room all upset because he said he saw a ball of fire go by the bathroom window." Not long after, Pegy reached out to Stevens, who noted that she was very nervous and would not even provide her name. Pegy was deeply troubled and needed to discuss what she and her friend had seen. Another 6 weeks would pass before Stevens received a second call from Pegy. This time she agreed to give her full name, as well as consent to an interview. And what a story she had to tell. Pegy, a government worker, described how prior to her sighting, many of her neighbors had reported that their dogs had gone missing. One neighbor was certain that she had seen, quote, little men making off with her dog one evening. A number of them had also reported seeing strange lights and objects hovering over their houses. Also, immediately after her sighting, Pegy described how she began experiencing a type of poltergeist activity in her home. She had seen the shadow of a man materialize and then disappear on several occasions. And she had also seen objects in the house moving, apparently by themselves. Her cat would hiss and arch its back at nothing. Though the strangest part of the story was yet to come. During the Christmas holidays, Pegy, in hopes of earning some spending money, took a job moonlighting as a security guard with a large discount store. Not long after starting, a man employed there as a security guard began paying her a lot of attention, often asking her out for coffee. She would only refer to him as Mr. X, and noted he seemed, quote, old and yet young at the same time. There was something very odd about this man. He would often steer their conversation towards the topic of UFOs, asserting that he was a member of some type of cosmic brotherhood, essentially intimating that he was himself one of the visitors. Pegy humored him, questioning him about his past and various aspects of his supposed Space Brothers affiliation. He told her that he had worked many jobs in his life, including being a professor at a well-known college. Stevens, in her follow-up investigation, found there was no record of such a person having been employed by the college. He insisted that he was extremely old, and if he told Pegy how old, quote, "you'd never believe me." One of Peggy's co-workers found Mr. X's stories to be utterly preposterous, and called him out to his face, telling him that he was spewing hogwash. This is when things took a sinister turn, as Mr. X looked at the co-worker and said, "If you don't get away from here and forget what you've heard, I'll turn myself into the most horrible thing you've ever seen." At this point, Pegy swears that something truly bizarre occurred, and she actually had trouble describing it. Mr. X's eyes appeared to light up, which caused the co-worker to retreat in fright. Shortly after Pegy quit her job, she never saw Mr. X again. Stevens did manage to confirm that this person, Mr. X, had worked at the store at the time Pegy did, though he had subsequently moved on. All other attempts at tracking him down or finding evidence of previous employment proved futile. He seems to have appeared for a little while from nowhere and returned to the same place, Stevens noted. Sadly, not long after, Pegy suffered a nervous breakdown, and her family felt it best to have her placed in a mental hospital for a period of observation. Stevens wondered if she was suffering from some type of mental illness all along, or had the strange events she experienced somehow caused it. Stevens did manage to confirm many aspects of her story, including the missing dogs, the UFO sighting, and the co-worker, though she wasn't sure, and she decided that it was best to put the whole thing behind her. Though that all changed one night in February 1968, when Jennifer received a phone call from a young boy. This phone call would change her life and place her at the center of a truly frightening UFO event. Stevens had taken the call. The boy was from the same area that Pegy lived. He told her that he and a friend had been packing snow on the riverbank to make a sort of slide so that their toboggan could zip out onto the then frozen Mohawk River. It was getting dark, and as the boys turned to go home, they saw rising from behind some bushes on an island in the river a small, glowing fireball, which hovered for some moments before disappearing. Then one of the boys spotted what appeared to be a figure wearing a white suit lurking behind one of the bushes, watching them. He told the other boy, which sent them both screaming for home, running as fast as they could. Once there, they told their parents, who then got in touch with Stevens. Stevens thought it interesting and filed it away. It wasn't until a few hours later that the importance of that phone call would become clear. The next morning, approximately 300 yards from where the fireball was sighted, a 16-year-old boy was found dead. Authorities discovered his body was frozen deeply into the ice. It had been relatively mild, and yet this boy was frozen solid, which the investigators found to be quite strange. The authorities ultimately deemed it death due to exposure. They were unable to explain why his tracks showed that he had apparently been running, then dragging one foot as if being pulled from above. There were no other tracks. Stevens found the whole thing quite bizarre. She wondered if, had he chosen to stop, why not under a tree? Why out on some frozen ice? Why were his tracks so strange? It was about 24 hours later before she was told she could go discreetly into the area and examine the tracks herself and take Geiger counter readings. She noted the tracks came down the bank into the river, then there's running and then dragging, leading to that grim melted circle in the ice where the boy's body had been found. The Geiger counter readings showed nothing but normal background radiation. The tracks indicated that he was running from something and then somehow was being pulled up into the sky, hence his one foot seemingly dragging. If he was being chased by another person or an animal, most assuredly they would have found their tracks too, but there was nothing. Just the boy walking, apparently seeing something, running, getting pulled up, and then death. Stevens managed to track down the two people who found the body, a pair of young boys. They told Stevens that when they saw him and approached him, they could see that he had a, quote, real scared look on his face. Stevens wondered if there was somehow a connection between the UFO sighted that night and the death of this young boy. She had heard cases of people being frightened to death, and this boy did have a history of rheumatic heart. She wondered if he also saw the same UFO witnessed by the two tobogganers and collapsed and died due to fright. That still didn't explain the state he was in when they found the body, nor did it explain the dragging marks. The coroner's verdict was that he had died of exposure, but Jennifer sensed that there was more to the story, and she was determined to find out what that was. I couldn't very well start yelling UFO murder, not unless I wanted to end up where the lady was, who lost her dog, she noted. In the days that followed, Jennifer and the group of UFO investigators she worked with decided to try and patrol the riverbank each night and see if they could get any clues. After several nights of bitter cold, frozen toes and noses, they had a sighting. An oval red object fluttered in silently over the island. It hovered, blinking on and off. Jennifer grabbed the big flashlight and signaled back. In a moment, it blinked back. This interchange went on for several minutes, and then the object began to move towards them. The hair began to rise on the back of my neck. Had I done a stupid thing, Jennifer recalled thinking? The group on the bank sensed that they might be in danger, and as they contemplated running back to their vehicles, a big jet suddenly appeared, moving overhead. The UFO did an abrupt about-face and sped away toward the mountains on the other side of the river. Jennifer thought her evening of excitement had come to an end. She was wrong. When she and Peter, her husband, returned home, they found their 15-year-old daughter Jenny in a highly tense state. She told them that the phone had been ringing all evening. She would answer it and hear nothing at the other end but heavy breathing. When her boyfriend called to calm her down, they were interrupted several times by high-pitched beeping noises. On 2 different occasions, their calls ended abruptly. The next day, the calls continued. Sometimes there would be mechanical sounds. Other times there would be high-pitched whining and a beeping sound that sent sharp pains through their mastoid bones. Jennifer and Peter found this odd as their number was unlisted, so she was certain that whomever had attained it had not gotten it out of the phone book. She called the phone company and they gave their line a complete check with no findings, although the serviceman offered his personal opinion that the line could have been tapped. But by who? Jennifer had not made public any information at the time, so no one except her and her team knew what their suspicions were. Several days after this, Peter, a building contractor, was in a large downtown store inspecting some work his team was doing. He stopped at a snack bar for a cup of coffee. A few moments after, he seated himself, a tall, tan, saturnine-looking man whom he had never seen before, sat down next to him and began discussing the case, beginning with, "There have been people watching the sky every night down by the river in Scotia." Peter was one of those people. He was a little surprised by what the man was saying, wondering how he knew, but he kept his cool. "I beg your pardon?" he asked the stranger. The man then went on to talk about UFOs. Peter sensed that this fellow knew way too much about what he and his wife were up to, and attempted to find out more information on who he was and what he wanted from them. All these questions were either parried or avoided by this stranger. Peter began to feel deeply uncomfortable when the stranger excused himself after noting, "People who look for UFOs should be very careful." Thinking back, Jennifer recalled that Pegy had described seeing 2 dark-skinned men with completely expressionless faces stringing silver tape on the wires near her home. Since they did not have a car with a phone company logo indicating who they worked for, she called the police. The men left before the police arrived, and the only comment made by the officers was, "Oh, the silver tape again?" At the time, Jennifer thought very little of this story, yet now, with all the things happening with their phone, She began to wonder. Jennifer realized that much of what happened to Pegy was also happening to her, including poltergeist activity. As their phone issues began to lessen, another problem began to manifest. Apparently, their home had become haunted. They began to hear strange noises at all hours of the day and night. Doors would open and close by themselves. One evening, a pair of scissors and a brass candlestick jumped off a cabinet and crashed to the floor. Even their Siamese cat was affected, becoming irritable and hissing at nothing. Then, as suddenly as it started, it ceased. During the weeks that followed, Jennifer, her husband, and many of the others who had patrolled the bank found themselves being followed by a light blue Lincoln bearing West Virginia license plates. Then it all stopped. The poltergeist activity, the strange visits by odd people, being followed by cars, it all stopped. Jennifer Stevens eventually published a lengthy article about the strange events titled UFOs Mystery on the Mohawk. It was published in the June 1969 Special Edition 2 of the Flying Saucer Review, Beyond. In the article, Jennifer acknowledged that she might be asking for trouble by publishing the piece, but felt that it was important to get the information out to the public. Sadly, 2 months later, her worst fears became a reality when her husband Peter, still in his 30s, died very suddenly. Anguished, Jennifer completely abandoned the UFO subject. John Keel, who was at the time a friend of Jennifer's, attempted to reach out to her, but he was never able to learn the full circumstances of Peter's death. She would tell me only that it was related to the UFO business in some way, noted Keel. Jennifer Stevens' case is fascinating in that it involves so many aspects of the paranormal overlapping to the point where it's nearly impossible to not conclude that they are all connected in some way. The missing dogs, the UFOs, the dead boy, the strange co-worker with glowing eyes, the figure in white hiding in the bushes by the bank, the MIB visits, the phone calls, and even the poltergeist activity. They all seem to be acting in conjunction with each other to both intrigue and frighten those persons involved. But why? What is the point? Is poltergeist activity somehow connected to the UFO phenomenon? Most people would say no, they are two different things. But this case suggests otherwise, that ghosts and aliens and MIB and everything else are a part of something larger, playing their role in dismantling our sense of what is and isn't possible in this reality. Ultimately, Jennifer Stevens walked away from the UFO subject. Maybe this is what they, the visitors, were trying to accomplish all along, or at least after she began to show a deep interest in their activities. Personally, I don't know what to make of this case, and I think that's exactly the way they want it. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed. See you next week.